May 12, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for exactly 4 days, but inside the mess hall of Camp Lone Star, Texas, a different kind of battle was unfolding. 63 German women prisoners sat frozen in their seats, staring at the plates before them with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something approaching fear. On each white ceramic plate sat 2 large bell peppers, one red and one green, split lengthwise and filled to overflowing with a mixture that gleamed with moisture and rich, dark meat. Steam rose from the peppers in delicate wisps, carrying with it an aroma that should have been impossible. The scent of seasoned ground beef, tomatoes, rice, and herbs filled the air so thoroughly that it seemed to mock everything these women had known about wartime deprivation. 24-year-old Greta Hoffman sat at the end of the long wooden table, her hands gripping the edge so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She had served as a radio operator for the Wehrmacht in France, had been captured during the chaotic retreat of January 1945, and had spent the last 4 months in American custody. In all that time, she had not seen this much meat in a single meal. In fact, she had not seen this much meat in a single month during the final years of the war in Germany. Next to her, Anna Kirschner, a former nurse from Hamburg, leaned forward slightly, her breath catching as she studied the impossible bounty before them. The peppers themselves were enormous, larger than any vegetable she had seen outside of peacetime photographs. But it was what filled them that defied understanding. Ground meat mixed with rice, onions, and what appeared to be cheese melted on top. Real cheese, real meat, in portions that would have fed an entire German family for days. Across the table, Elsa Muller, at 32, the oldest among them, simply stared. Her face had gone pale. She had worked in food distribution in Berlin during the war's final months. She knew exactly what German civilians had been eating: turnips, sawdust bread, potato peelings when they were lucky. Her own mother had died during the winter, weakened by months of malnutrition until a simple cold had killed her. And here, in an enemy prison camp, sat more food on a single plate than her mother had seen in her final weeks of life. The American guard standing near the door, Corporal James Mitchell, watched the women's reactions with an expression of confusion. He had grown up on a ranch in West Texas, where stuffed bell peppers were a common weeknight dinner. He had no framework for understanding what he was witnessing. To him, this was ordinary food, perhaps even modest by American standards. He could not comprehend that for these women, what sat before them represented an abundance so extreme it seemed like a hallucination. One of the German women, a slight blonde named Frieda Koch, began to cry silently. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she stared at the plate. She made no move to pick up her fork. None of them did. The mess hall fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of Frieda's quiet weeping and the distant clatter of pots in the kitchen. The stuffed bell peppers continued to steam, their aroma growing stronger, more insistent, more impossible with each passing moment. November 3, 1944, the canvas-covered military truck bounced along the dirt road leading to Camp Lone Star, carrying its unusual cargo of captured German women. Greta Hoffman pressed her face against the small opening in the back, catching glimpses of the Texas landscape as it rolled past. Even in late autumn, the countryside seemed impossibly green compared to the scorched earth she had left behind in France. The vastness of it unsettled her. Miles and miles of farmland with no bomb craters, no burned villages, no evidence whatsoever that a war was being fought anywhere in the world. The 63 women had been processed through a facility in New York before being transported to this remote camp in West Texas. They represented a unique problem for American military authorities. Female prisoners of war were rare, and the existing camp infrastructure had been designed entirely for men. Camp Lone Star, originally constructed to house Italian POWs who had since been repatriated, had been hastily modified to accommodate women. The women wore a mixture of their original gray auxiliary uniforms and civilian clothes that had been issued to replace items too damaged for continued use. Anna Kirchner still wore her nurse's cap, though it was creased and stained. It was one of the few possessions she had managed to keep through her capture and transport. She clutched it now as the truck slowed, approaching the camp entrance. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison stood waiting as the truck came to a stop. She was one of only 3 female officers assigned to oversee the facility, a responsibility she had never imagined when she joined the Women's Army Corps 2 years earlier. She had been briefed extensively about what to expect: hostile prisoners, potential security risks, women who had served the Nazi regime in various capacities. What she had not been briefed about was how young they would look. As the women climbed down from the truck, Morrison found herself looking at faces that could have belonged to her younger sister, to her former college roommates, to the girls she had taught in Sunday school back in Virginia. The oldest among them was only 32. Most were in their early 20s. Several looked barely 18. The processing began immediately. The women were led into the administration building where they were photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned identification numbers. Else Muller watched as each woman ahead of her in line received a small package: toiletries, 2 changes of clothes, a blanket, and a towel. Simple items, but new and clean. When her turn came, Elsa accepted the package with trembling hands. The towel alone was better quality than anything she had owned in the past 2 years. As the sun began to set over the Texas plains, the women were led to their barracks. The building was simple but sturdy, with rows of metal frame beds, each with a mattress, pillow, and 2 blankets. Lieutenant Morrison watched from the doorway as the prisoners entered. She noticed how they moved carefully, almost reverently, touching the beds as if afraid they might disappear. Greta Hoffman lay awake on her bunk that first night, her mind returning to the lessons she had received during her training for the Women's Auxiliary Corps. The instructors had been very clear about what to expect if captured by the Americans. The lectures had been designed to prevent surrender, to ensure that German personnel would fight to the death rather than fall into enemy hands. She could still hear Instructor Richter's voice echoing in the training hall in Berlin. The Americans are savage in their treatment of prisoners. They starve their captives systematically, using food deprivation as a weapon of war. The instructor had shown them photographs, supposedly smuggled from American POW camps, showing emaciated prisoners behind barbed wire. "These are German soldiers in American custody," Richter had declared. "This is the mercy of our enemies." Greta had believed every word. Why wouldn't she? The instructor was an officer, a party member, someone in a position to know the truth, and the photographs had seemed authentic enough. Now, lying in a bed with clean sheets and 2 wool blankets, Greta wondered about those photographs. Had they been real? Had they shown American camps at all? Or had they been images from somewhere else entirely, repurposed to serve the propaganda narrative? Anna Kirchner's training had included similar warnings, though hers had come through medical channels. The chief physician at her hospital in Hamburg had gathered the nursing staff for a special briefing about captured medical personnel. "The Americans do not respect the Red Cross conventions," he had told them solemnly. "German nurses captured by American forces are subjected to interrogation, mistreatment, and worse." He had never specified what worse meant, but the implication had been clear enough to fill Anna with dread. She had been taught that American soldiers, particularly those of the mixed racial backgrounds, were especially brutal toward German women. The propaganda had painted a picture of an American military composed primarily of criminals released from prisons to fight the war. Else Muller had received her information through different channels. Working in food distribution in Berlin, she had attended regular briefings about enemy capabilities and intentions. The officials had repeatedly assured them that American abundance was a myth, propaganda designed to weaken German morale. "The Americans are starving just as we are," the distribution officer had insisted. "Their newspapers show prosperity, but these are elaborate deceptions. In reality, their cities are suffering just as Berlin suffers." Elsa had wanted to believe this, but it made the deprivation easier to bear if she could imagine that everyone, everywhere, was enduring the same hardships. Now, after seeing the American countryside from the truck, after receiving new clothes and blankets, after sleeping in a heated barracks, she felt the first crack forming in everything she had been told. The morning of November 4th, 1944, began with a sound that none of the German women had heard in years, a bell ringing to signal breakfast rather than an air raid siren. Greta woke slowly, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings and the peculiar absence of fear that had accompanied every morning for the past 2 years. Around her, the other women stirred, sitting up on their bunks with expressions of confusion and lingering exhaustion from the long journey. Lieutenant Morrison appeared at the barracks door precisely at 6:30. Her voice was firm, but not unkind, as she addressed them in carefully pronounced German. "Guten Morgen, breakfast is served in the mess hall. You will form a line and proceed in an orderly manner." The walk to the mess hall took less than 3 minutes, but for Greta, every step felt surreal. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and dust rather than smoke and ash. When they entered the mess hall, the smell hit them first. Coffee, real coffee, not the acorn substitute that had become standard in Germany. The aroma was so rich and genuine that several women stopped walking, causing a brief confusion in the line. Anna felt her stomach clench with a hunger she had been suppressing for months. Behind a long counter stood 3 American soldiers who appeared to be serving food. This alone was remarkable. In German facilities, prisoners served themselves or received minimal rations directly. Here, the Americans were actively distributing food to their captives. As the line moved forward, Greta could see what was being served, and her mind struggled to process the reality before her eyes. Scrambled eggs. Not 1 egg per person, but generous portions of fluffy yellow eggs that must have come from at least 2 or 3 eggs each. Sliced bread. White bread, not the dark, dense loaves mixed with sawdust that had become standard in wartime Germany. Butter. Actual butter in small paper-wrapped portions. And bacon. Strips of crispy bacon that represented more meat than most German civilians had seen in a single meal in years. When Greta reached the counter, the soldier placed a full plate in her hands. 3 eggs worth of scrambled mixture, 2 slices of buttered bread, 4 strips of bacon, and a small cup of what appeared to be canned peaches. Greta carried her plate to the nearest table and sat down, staring at the food. Around her, the other women were doing the same. 63 German prisoners sat in complete silence, looking at their breakfast plates as if they contained evidence of something impossible. Else Muller's hands shook as she picked up her fork. The last time she had eaten real eggs had been in the spring of 1943, more than 18 months ago, and here were 3 eggs worth on a single plate in an enemy prison camp, served as if it were nothing remarkable at all. Anna Kirchner set down her fork without taking a single bite. Her medical training had taught her to be observant, to notice details that others might miss, and everything about this situation felt wrong. The abundance was too extreme, too theatrical. It had to be a trick. Around the mess hall, she noticed similar reactions from her fellow prisoners. Some women stared at their plates with obvious longing, but made no move to eat. Others had lifted their forks halfway to their mouths before setting them down again, as if an invisible barrier prevented them from actually consuming the food. Frieda Koch, the young blonde woman who sat across from Anna, whispered in German, "It has to be poisoned. Why else would they feed us like this?" The propaganda lessons had been explicit. Americans used deception as a primary weapon. They would gain your trust through false kindness, then exploit that trust to extract information, or worse. Else Muller's years of managing food distribution had taught her to be suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. And this breakfast was far too good to be true. She had calculated rations for thousands of German civilians during the war's final years. She knew exactly how much food should be allocated per person under wartime conditions. This single breakfast contained more calories than a German civilian's entire daily ration. It was impossible. Therefore, it must be a trick. Lieutenant Morrison watched from her position near the wall, noting the untouched plates with growing concern. She approached the nearest table where Greta sat with her full plate. "Is something wrong with the meal?" Morrison asked in her careful German. Greta looked up, trying to find words to explain what felt unexplainable. How could she tell this American officer that the food itself was suspicious, that abundance itself had become untrustworthy? Finally, she managed, "It is too much. We do not understand why you give us this." Morrison's confusion was genuine. This is standard breakfast. This is what American soldiers eat every morning. But her words only deepened the prisoner's suspicion. If this was standard, if Americans ate this way every day while Germany starved, then everything they had been told about the war, about American suffering, about the righteousness of their cause, was a lie. And that possibility was more terrifying than any poison could be. The breakfast grew cold. The eggs congealed on their plates, the bacon lost its crispness, and 63 German women sat in an American mess hall, surrounded by more food than they had seen in years, slowly starving themselves because they could not believe that their enemies might actually intend to feed them. Private Chen spoke quietly to the soldier next to him. "They're not eating. Why aren't they eating?" The other soldier shrugged. "Maybe they don't like bacon." But it wasn't about preference. It was about trust collapsing under the weight of propaganda, finally meeting reality. 3 days. That was how long the silent standoff lasted. 3 days of meals served and meals refused. 3 days of plates piled with food returned to the kitchen barely touched. 3 days of Lieutenant Morrison filing increasingly concerned reports to her superiors about prisoners who seemed determined to starve themselves rather than accept American rations. On the morning of November 7th, the situation reached a breaking point. Frida Koch woke before dawn with such intense hunger pangs that she could barely stand. At 20 years old, she was among the youngest of the prisoners, and her body simply could not sustain continued refusal of food. She had been surviving on nothing but water and the smallest possible bites of bread, enough to keep from collapsing, but not enough to satisfy the deep, aching emptiness in her stomach. During breakfast that morning, Frida sat at her usual table, staring at her plate with the same mixture of fear and longing that had characterized the past 3 days. But something had changed. Her hands shook, not just with nervousness, but with genuine physical weakness. Her vision had begun to blur at the edges. She knew the signs of serious malnutrition from her time in Germany during the final months of the war. She was approaching the point where refusal of food would cause lasting damage. Around her, she could hear the quiet German conversations that had become routine, speculation about when the poisoning would occur, theories about what the Americans were really planning. But underneath those conversations, Frida could hear something else, the sound of stomachs growling. They were all starving themselves, clinging to suspicion, while their bodies screamed for sustenance. She picked up her fork. The weight of it felt enormous in her weakened hand. Across the table, Anna Kirchner watched Frida with the trained eye of a nurse. She could see the trembling, the pallor, the signs of a body beginning to shut down from lack of nutrition. If this continued, Anna knew, there would be medical consequences. Some of the women were already showing signs of dangerous malnutrition. As a medical professional, she felt torn between her suspicion of American motives and her understanding of human physiology. The body could not survive on suspicion alone. Frida lifted a small piece of scrambled egg to her mouth. Every woman at nearby tables stopped talking. All eyes turned to watch this moment of capitulation, or courage, depending on one's perspective. Frida closed her eyes and placed the egg in her mouth. The taste was overwhelming. Salt, butter, actual egg from actual chickens. Her body's response was immediate and undeniable. Saliva flooded her mouth. Her stomach cramped with desperate hunger. She swallowed, and then, before she could stop herself, she took another bite, and another. Within minutes, Frida had consumed half her plate. She ate with single-minded intensity, no longer caring about poison or propaganda or what any of this meant. She was simply a starving young woman eating food, following the most basic human instinct for survival. Around the mess hall, something shifted. One by one, other women began to eat. First, hesitantly, taking small bites while watching Frida for signs of illness. Then, with increasing conviction, as they realized the food was exactly what it appeared to be: food. By the end of breakfast, 40 of the 63 women had eaten substantial portions of their meals. The remaining 23 still refused, but their resolve was visibly weakening. Greta Hoffmann ate her first full meal in American captivity that evening, and with each bite came memories of what eating had meant during the final years of the war in Germany. The contrast was so severe that she found herself crying silently as she chewed, tears mixing with the taste of roasted chicken and mashed potatoes. She remembered the winter of 1944 in Berlin, when the ration cards had become increasingly worthless because there was simply nothing to purchase with them. Her family had learned to make soup from potato peelings, boiling them for hours to extract any possible nutrition from what had once been thrown away as garbage. Her younger sister had developed a cough that winter that never quite went away, a wet rattling sound that spoke of a body too weakened by malnutrition to fight off simple infections. Anna Kirchner's memories were even more haunting because she had seen the effects of starvation from a medical perspective. Working in the Hamburg hospital during the final months before her deployment to France, she had treated countless civilians suffering from malnutrition-related illnesses. Children with distended bellies and hollow eyes. Elderly patients who simply stopped eating because their rations were so inadequate that death seemed preferable to prolonged suffering. The hospital itself had been on starvation rations. Anna had learned to function on fewer than 1,000 calories per day, her body consuming its own muscle tissue to survive. She had lost nearly 30 pounds during her final year in Hamburg. Now, sitting in an American mess hall, with a plate containing more calories than she had eaten in 3 days back home, she felt a complex mixture of relief and rage. Else Mueller's memories were the most bitter, because she had been responsible for distributing the inadequate food that kept Berlin's population barely alive. She knew the exact numbers, had calculated them hundreds of times. The official ration for an adult German civilian in the winter of 1945 had been 1,200 calories per day. But that was only on paper. In reality, supply disruptions meant that most civilians received far less. 700 calories, 500 calories, some days nothing at all. She had stood behind distribution counters and watched mothers plead for extra rations for their children. She had turned them away because there was nothing to give. The bread she had distributed in those final months had been made from flour mixed with sawdust and ground acorns. It was gray-brown in color and tasted like wet cardboard, but people ate it because the alternative was starvation. Now Else held a slice of white bread in her hands, soft and fresh, made from pure wheat flour. She calculated automatically, this single slice contained more nutritional value than an entire day's ration of the sawdust bread she had distributed in Berlin. The weight of that realization was crushing. May 12, 1945. 6 months after their arrival at Camp Lone Star, the German women had settled into a routine that bore little resemblance to what they had imagined captivity would be. They worked in various camp facilities, attended English classes that Lieutenant Morrison had organized, and ate 3 meals per day that continued to astonish them with their abundance. But nothing had prepared them for the stuffed bell peppers. Greta was the first to enter the mess hall that evening, and the first to see the plates already set out on the tables. She stopped so suddenly that Anna, walking behind her, nearly collided with her back. For a long moment, Greta simply stared at the impossible sight before her. The peppers themselves were enormous, each one the size of her fist, cut in half lengthwise to create boats of red and green. But it was their contents that made her breath catch in her throat. Ground meat. Not the tiny portions they occasionally received mixed into other dishes, but pure ground beef, seasoned and cooked until it glistened with fat and juice. Mixed with rice, onions, and topped with melted cheese that had formed a golden crust across the surface. Each half pepper was a self-contained meal, and there were 2 on every plate, 4 pepper halves worth of meat per person, more meat than Greta had seen in a single meal during the entire final year of the war in Germany. Anna moved past Greta and approached the nearest table, bending down to examine the food as if it might be a mirage. The smell was intoxicating. Rich beef fat, the sweetness of cooked peppers, the sharp tang of tomato sauce, and underneath it all, the complex aroma of herbs and spices. Oregano, basil, garlic. Ingredients that had vanished from German markets years ago, now used casually to flavor food for prisoners. Else Muller entered the mess hall and immediately understood that something significant was happening. The women who had arrived before her were standing motionless, staring at the tables with expressions that ranged from shock to something approaching religious awe. She made her way to the front to see what had caused this reaction and felt her knees weaken when she saw the stuffed peppers. In her role managing food distribution in Berlin, Elsa had become an expert at calculating the meat content of various dishes. She looked at the stuffed pepper and made her calculations automatically. Each pepper half contained approximately 4 ounces of ground beef. 2 halves per plate meant 8 ounces of meat per person, half a pound of beef. For prisoners, for one meal. The impossibility of it was staggering. Private Chen had helped prepare the stuffed peppers that afternoon under the supervision of Sergeant Martinez, who considered them comfort food. He had no idea his simple family recipe was causing existential crisis in the minds of 63 German women. Frida Koch was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough to be heard in the silent mess hall. "They are feeding us better than the Wehrmacht fed its own soldiers." The statement hung in the air, impossible to dismiss because every woman in the room knew it was true. During the final year of the war, even frontline German troops had been on reduced rations. The famous Wehrmacht logistics system that had once been the envy of Europe had collapsed under the pressure of Allied bombing and supply shortages. Soldiers in the field often survived on ersatz coffee, stale bread, and whatever they could scavenge from the countryside. And here were their captors, the supposed enemy, serving them meals that would have been considered luxurious in any German military facility during the past 2 years of the war. Greta sat down slowly, her mind struggling to reconcile what was before her with everything she had believed about the world. The propaganda had been clear and consistent. America was a nation of weaklings grown soft from excess. Yes, but that excess was a lie, a facade maintained through photographs and films, while their actual population suffered just as much as Germany's. Except it was not a lie. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The American soldiers guarding them were well-fed, healthy, and strong. The camp itself was maintained with materials that suggested no shortage of resources. And most damning of all, they were feeding their prisoners half a pound of beef in a single meal, as if it were nothing remarkable. Anna's nurse training had taught her to trust empirical evidence over ideology. What you could observe and measure was more reliable than what you were told to believe. And the evidence before her was irrefutable. America had food, abundant food, food enough to feed prisoners of war better than Germany had fed its own citizens. Which meant that everything about the rationale for the war, everything about German superiority and American weakness, had been based on false premises. Else Muller felt something breaking inside her chest. For years, she had told hungry Berliners that their sacrifice was necessary, that everyone was suffering equally, that the deprivation was temporary and would lead to eventual victory and prosperity. She had believed it herself because the alternative was too horrific to contemplate. But sitting before this plate of stuffed peppers, she could no longer maintain that belief. Lieutenant Morrison finally spoke, her voice cutting through the thick silence. "Ladies, please sit down and eat. The food is getting cold." But her practical words could not address the psychological crisis unfolding in the mess hall. These women were not simply deciding whether to eat stuffed peppers, they were confronting the collapse of their entire worldview. Around the room, women began to sit slowly, mechanically. They picked up their forks with trembling hands, and one by one, they began to eat while tears streamed down their faces. Private Klaus Weber had been watching the German women's reactions to the stuffed peppers with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. Unlike most of the American guards at Camp Lone Star, Weber had a personal understanding of what these women were experiencing. He had been born in Milwaukee to German immigrant parents who had come to America in 1928, seeking better opportunities and escaping the economic chaos of Weimar Germany. He spoke fluent German, though with an American accent that marked him as foreign to native speakers. After the dinner service had ended and most of the prisoners had returned to their barracks, Weber approached Lieutenant Morrison with a request. "Ma'am, I think I might be able to help them understand what they're seeing here, if you'll permit me to speak with them." Morrison granted permission with the caveat that another guard would be present during any conversation. That evening, Weber entered the prisoners' barracks common room where about 20 women had gathered. Greta, Anna, Elsa, and Frida were among them, sitting in small groups and speaking in hushed German about the day's meal. Weber cleared his throat and addressed them in their native language. "Guten Abend, my name is Private Klaus Weber. I was born in America, but my parents came from Germany. I wanted to talk to you about what you experienced today at dinner." The women looked up with varying expressions of surprise and suspicion. Weber sat down on one of the wooden chairs, deliberately making himself non-threatening. "I watched your faces when you saw the stuffed peppers. I saw shock and confusion and something that looked like grief. I want to explain something about America that you may not understand." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "In Germany, you were taught that America was weak, that our abundance was propaganda, that we were suffering just as you were suffering. But it was not propaganda. America is rich in ways that are difficult for Europeans to understand. We have so much farmland, so much productive capacity that feeding our population well is simply normal." Els spoke up, her voice sharp with challenge. "If America is so rich, why did you not share that wealth? Why did you let Europe starve?" Weber's response was measured. "America did share. We sent food to Britain, to the Soviet Union, to our allies. Millions of tons of food, but we could not send food to Germany because Germany was trying to destroy us. Your government chose war. That choice had consequences." Greta leaned forward. "But the propaganda told us you were our enemies, that you wanted to destroy Germany, that you were cruel, yet you feed us like this. Why?" Weber's answer cut to the heart of American philosophy. "Because in America, we believe that how you treat your enemies says more about who you are than how you treat your friends. We feed you well, not because we have forgotten that we were at war, but because we believe that all people deserve basic dignity, even those who fought against us. This is not weakness, this is strength." The room fell silent as the women absorbed his words. They had been taught that mercy was weakness, that cruelty demonstrated power. Weber was presenting an entirely different philosophy, one where strength was measured by compassion, even to those who did not deserve it. Greta sat at the small wooden table in the barracks common room, a piece of paper before her and a pencil in her trembling hand. Lieutenant Morrison had announced that prisoners could write letters to family members in Germany, though she had been careful to explain that delivery could not be guaranteed given the chaos of the occupation. The letters would be reviewed by censors and sent through Red Cross channels when possible. But Greta was not writing because she believed the letter would reach her family. She was writing because she needed to put into words the impossible reality she was living. "Dear Mama and Papa," she began in careful German script, "I am a prisoner of war in Texas, America. I am healthy and safe, but I must tell you something that you will not believe." She paused, trying to find words that would not sound like madness. How could she explain what she had experienced? How could she describe abundance so extreme that it contradicted everything they knew about wartime existence? She continued writing, "The Americans feed us 3 meals every day, real meals with meat and vegetables and bread made from pure wheat flour. Yesterday they served us bell peppers stuffed with half a pound of beef per person. I am not exaggerating. Half a pound of beef for prisoners in a single meal." She read back what she had written and realized it sounded like propaganda or delusion. No one in Germany would believe that enemy captors were providing such food. They would think she had been brainwashed or coerced into writing false statements. Around the common room, other women were engaged in similar struggles. Anna wrote to her sister in Hamburg, trying to describe the medical supplies available in the camp infirmary. Bandages, antiseptics, pain medications, all in quantities that seemed impossible given what she had experienced in German hospitals. "They treat our minor injuries as if they matter," she wrote, "as if we are people rather than prisoners." Elsa's letter to her surviving brother was the most detailed because her administrative mind could not help but calculate and record. "They provide us with 2,500 calories per day minimum. That is more than double what Berlin civilians received during the final months. The waste alone from the American mess hall would feed a German family for a week." Frida wrote to her mother, though she had received no word about whether her mother had survived the bombing of Dresden. Her letter was the most emotional, filled with confusion and guilt. "Mama, I do not understand why they are kind to us. We were their enemies. We served the Reich, yet they treat us with dignity and feed us as if we were guests rather than captives. What does this mean? Were we wrong about everything?" The letters piled up on Lieutenant Morrison's desk, waiting to be reviewed and forwarded through official channels. Most would never reach their intended recipients, but they served a purpose nonetheless, allowing the women to articulate the cognitive dissonance that was reshaping their understanding of the world. December 24, 1944. The prisoners had been at Camp Lone Star for nearly 2 months, and while they had grown somewhat accustomed to American abundance, nothing prepared them for what Sergeant Martinez had planned for Christmas dinner. The mess hall had been decorated with simple paper chains and pine branches that Private Chen had gathered from the surrounding countryside. The effort was modest but genuine, an attempt to create holiday atmosphere in an unlikely setting. When the German women entered for the evening meal, they found the tables arranged differently than usual. Instead of the standard rows, they had been pushed together to create one long table that could seat everyone together, prisoners and guards alike. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. In military facilities, officers ate separately from enlisted personnel, and prisoners ate separately from their captors. But tonight, on Christmas Eve, those distinctions had been deliberately set aside. Lieutenant Morrison stood at the head of the table as the women filed in and found seats. "Ladies," she said in her careful German, "tonight we celebrate together. In America, Christmas is a time when we remember that all people are children of God, regardless of which side of a war they find themselves on." The prisoners sat quietly, unsure how to respond to this unprecedented gesture of inclusion. Then the food began to arrive from the kitchen, and the women's carefully maintained composure crumbled. Roasted turkey, not small portions, but whole birds carved at the table, with each person receiving generous slices of white and dark meat. Mashed potatoes made with real butter and cream, smooth and rich. Gravy made from turkey drippings, green beans cooked with bacon, rolls made from wheat flour and served warm with butter, cranberry sauce that gleamed like rubies in small dishes, and pies, apple pies and pumpkin pies made with real sugar and cinnamon. Greta stared at her plate and felt tears beginning to form. The last Christmas she had spent in Germany, her family's entire holiday meal had consisted of turnip soup and a small piece of dark bread per person. They had sung carols and tried to maintain holiday spirit, but the hunger had been inescapable. Anna thought of the Christmas before she had been deployed to France. She had worked a double shift at the Hamburg hospital on Christmas Eve, tending to wounded soldiers and malnourished civilians. The hospital's holiday meal for staff had been ersatz coffee and a slightly larger portion of their usual thin soup. The contrast with what sat before her now was so extreme that it felt obscene. How could abundance like this exist in the same world where her patients had died from malnutrition? Private Weber, sitting near the middle of the table, began to sing Silent Night in German. His voice was untrained but sincere. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. One by one, the German women joined in, their voices harmonizing in the traditional melody they had known since childhood. When they finished, Private Chen started the English version, and the American soldiers sang together. Two languages, two nations that had been at war, united for 3 minutes in shared song. By the time the meal ended, something fundamental had shifted in the camp's atmosphere. The morning after Christmas, Greta approached Sergeant Martinez with a request that surprised both of them. Speaking in her improving English, she asked, "Sergeant, may I learn to cook the American food, the turkey and the stuffed peppers?" Martinez looked at her with curiosity. In his 15 years in the Army, he had never had a prisoner of war asked to learn recipes. But there was something genuine in Greta's request that moved him. She was not trying to gain favor or manipulate. She genuinely wanted to understand how to create the abundance she had witnessed. "Why do you want to learn?" he asked. Greta struggled to find the right English words. "Because someday the war ends. Someday I go home, and I want to teach my people how to make food like this." Martinez understood something in that moment that would later be included in his report to Lieutenant Morrison. These women were not just learning to accept American hospitality. They were preparing to become ambassadors of American values when they eventually returned to Germany. Teaching them to cook was teaching them about prosperity, about abundance, about a different way of organizing society. He agreed, and within a week, Greta had been joined by Anna, Elsa, and 6 other women who wanted to learn American cooking techniques. The camp kitchen became an unlikely classroom where former enemies learned to work together. Martinez taught them how to brown ground beef properly, how to season it with spices that had been unavailable in wartime Germany. He showed them how to select bell peppers, how to blanch them slightly before stuffing so they would cook evenly. The women learned that American cooking was not inherently complicated, but relied on the availability of quality ingredients in sufficient quantity. This was the real lesson. Abundance enabled generosity, and generosity enabled community. Private Chen, who often helped in the kitchen, taught them how to make his grandmother's fried rice, adapting a Chinese recipe to American ingredients. The cultural exchange went beyond simple recipes. Through cooking together, the women began to understand American pragmatism and innovation. Martinez showed them how to substitute ingredients when necessary, how to adapt recipes to what was available. This flexibility was deeply American, and it contrasted sharply with the rigid adherence to procedure that had characterized German institutions. Else, with her administrative background, began keeping detailed notes about recipes, measurements, and techniques. She wrote everything in a small notebook that Martinez had given her, creating what would eventually become a comprehensive guide to American cooking. Her notes included not just ingredients and instructions, but observations about American food philosophy. "They believe everyone should eat well," she wrote in one margin. "Not just officers or party members, everyone." The kitchen sessions became popular among the prisoners. Even women who did not participate directly would gather near the kitchen door, drawn by the aromas and the sound of laughter that increasingly accompanied the cooking lessons. Food was becoming a bridge between two cultures, proof that former enemies could find common ground in the simple act of preparing and sharing meals together. March 1945 brought news that shattered the fragile peace the German women had found in their American captivity. Letters began arriving through Red Cross channels, the first communication many prisoners had received from Germany in months. The letters painted a picture of devastation so complete that it seemed to belong to a different universe than the one they inhabited in Texas. Anna received word from her sister in Hamburg. The letter was brief, written on paper so thin it was nearly transparent, and the handwriting shaky from either cold or weakness. Anna, Mama is dead. Died February 5th from pneumonia, but really from hunger. She weighed 38 kilograms when she passed. There is no food. The ration cards are worthless. People are eating anything they can find. Please, if you can, send help. Anna read the letter 3 times before its meaning fully penetrated. Her mother had weighed 38 kilograms, 84 pounds, a grown woman reduced to the weight of a child through systematic starvation. And Anna had been eating stuffed bell peppers and roasted turkey while her mother died of hunger across the ocean. The guilt was crushing, physically painful in its intensity. She could not breathe properly, could not think beyond the simple, horrible fact that she had been fed while her mother starved. Greta's letter brought different but equally devastating news. Her younger sister had been killed in a bombing raid on Berlin in January. Her father was alive but displaced, living in a refugee camp with no permanent shelter. The letter, written by a neighbor, described conditions that seemed medieval in their brutality. No heat, no clean water, disease spreading through overcrowded facilities, and food so scarce that people fought over scraps. Else received no letter at all, which was somehow worse than receiving bad news. The silence meant uncertainty, an inability to know if her brother had survived or if anyone from her former life remained alive. Around the barracks, the atmosphere changed dramatically as more letters arrived and more women learned the extent of Germany's suffering. The cooking lessons stopped. The laughter that had begun to emerge during mealtimes disappeared. The women ate their American rations mechanically, each bite accompanied by the knowledge that their families were starving. Frida could not eat at all for 3 days after learning that her mother had survived Dresden's bombing, only to die later from malnutrition-related illness. She stared at her plates of food with an expression of such profound anguish that Private Chen finally asked Lieutenant Morrison if there was any way to send food packages to Germany. Morris's answer was gentle but firm. The occupation is still being established. Civilian aid will come, but it must go through official channels. Individual packages cannot be sent. The helplessness was as painful as the guilt. These women had access to abundance they could not share with the people they loved. They were living in comfort while their families suffered in ways that made their own wartime deprivation seem mild by comparison. The psychological toll was visible. Several women stopped attending English classes. Others requested permission to work longer hours in the kitchen or laundry, as if physical exhaustion might quiet the guilt that consumed them during moments of rest. Private Weber found Greta sitting alone in the camp library 3 days after she had received news of her sister's death. She was reading an American magazine, Life, looking at photographs of American cities and farms with an expression of intense concentration. Weber approached carefully, unsure if his presence would be welcome. "May I sit?" he asked in German. Greta nodded without looking up from the magazine. She pointed to a photograph showing a typical American supermarket, its shelves stocked with countless products. "This is real?" she asked. "This is not propaganda?" Weber looked at the image and nodded. "Yes, that is real. That is a normal grocery store in any American city." Greta turned the page to an advertisement showing a family dinner. Roast beef, multiple vegetable dishes, bread, butter, milk. The caption promoted a particular brand of dinnerware, but Greta was focused on the food itself. "And this? American families eat like this regularly?" Weber could hear the note of desperation in her question. She needed to understand how such abundance was possible. "Yes," he said carefully, "not every single day, and not every family has this much. But for most Americans, food security is not a daily worry. We have enough. Greta closed the magazine and looked at Weber directly. How? Germany is a developed nation. We have factories and universities and skilled workers. We had organization and efficiency, yet we starved while you prospered. I must understand why. Weber considered his answer carefully. This was not a question about recipes or military tactics. Greta was asking about fundamental differences in how societies organize themselves. It is complicated, he began, but I think it comes down to a few things. America has enormous natural resources and farmland. But more than that, we have a system that encourages production rather than control. Farmers produce food because they profit from it, not because the government orders them to. Innovation is rewarded. Efficiency creates wealth that can be reinvested. He paused, watching Greta process this information. And maybe most importantly, Americans believe that prosperity should be widely shared, not perfectly equally, but widely. A strong middle class is good for everyone, including the wealthy. Greta absorbed his words, comparing them to what she knew of German economic organization under the Reich. The command economy that had seemed so efficient in peacetime had collapsed under the pressure of total war. Resources had been directed toward military production, while civilian needs were systematically ignored. She thought of her mother waiting in line for hours to receive rations that were never adequate, of her sister dying in a bombing raid targeting factories that produced weapons but no food. We were told that sacrifice would lead to victory, Greta said quietly, that if we could just endure a little longer, prosperity would come. But the prosperity never came because the system itself was broken. Weber did not contradict her. He simply sat with her in the library while she confronted truths that her government had hidden behind propaganda and ideology. April 1945. The news of President Roosevelt's death reached Camp Lone Star and created an unexpected reaction among the German prisoners. Many of them wept openly, mourning a man who had been their enemy, but whom they had come to see as representative of the American values that had transformed their understanding of the world. Lieutenant Morrison was moved by their genuine grief, recognizing that these women had undergone a complete ideological transformation during their months in captivity. As the war in Europe moved toward its inevitable conclusion, Morrison called a meeting with the prisoners to discuss their eventual repatriation. The women gathered in the mess hall, their faces reflecting anxiety about an unknown future. Morrison spoke in her careful German. "The war will end soon. When it does, you will be returned to Germany through official channels. I want to prepare you for what you will find there." She did not soften the reality. Germany was devastated. Cities were in ruins. The occupation would be difficult. Food would be scarce for years to come. But she also offered hope. The American government is already planning reconstruction aid. We will help rebuild Germany because we believe that lasting peace requires prosperity, not punishment. Greta raised her hand, a gesture that had become common as the prisoners grew more comfortable participating in discussions. "Lieutenant, may I speak for some of us?" Morrison nodded. Greta stood, her posture straight, but her voice uncertain. "We have been talking among ourselves about what we will do when we return home. We have learned things here that Germany will need." She gestured to the other women. "Els has learned about efficient resource distribution without corruption. Anna has learned modern medical practices. I have learned how to teach languages and cultural understanding. We have all learned about agricultural abundance and food preparation. But most importantly, we have learned that former enemies can become friends, that prosperity is possible when societies value human dignity over ideology." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "We want to go home not as defeated prisoners, but as people who can help rebuild Germany into something better than what it was. We want to carry with us the lessons of American generosity and show our people that the former enemy can be a partner in creating a better future." The speech revealed how completely these women had transformed during their captivity. They were no longer the defiant auxiliary corps members who had arrived in November believing in German superiority and American cruelty. They had become advocates for a different vision of what Germany could become. Anna stood next to Greta. We want to remember everything. The stuffed bell peppers, yes, but also what they represented. The idea that abundance is possible, that people should be fed well regardless of their status, that kindness is strength rather than weakness. These are the things Germany will need to rebuild itself. Around the room, other women nodded in agreement. They had found purpose in their captivity, a mission that would give meaning to the suffering they had endured and witnessed. June 18, 1945. The repatriation orders had arrived, and the German women would be leaving Camp Lone Star within 48 hours. Transportation had been arranged to take them to the port in New York, where they would board ships bound for Europe and eventually to whatever remained of their homes in occupied Germany. Sergeant Martinez had planned a final meal, a farewell dinner that would mark the end of their time in American captivity. When the women entered the mess hall that evening, they immediately recognized what sat on the tables. Stuffed bell peppers, the same dish that had shocked them 7 months earlier, that had forced them to confront the collapse of everything they believed about the war and their enemies. But their reaction this time was entirely different. Instead of frozen disbelief, there was recognition and something approaching affection. These peppers represented the journey they had made from enemy prisoners to something far more complex. Greta sat down and looked at her plate with eyes that had learned to see differently. She remembered the first time she had encountered this dish, how the abundance had seemed impossible, how she had cried while eating because each bite destroyed another piece of propaganda she had believed. Now she understood that the stuffed peppers were not just food. They were a symbol of American values, of a society that fed even its enemies well because it believed in human dignity regardless of circumstances. Anna picked up her fork and took the first bite slowly, deliberately savoring the flavors she had learned to recognize. Ground beef seasoned with oregano and garlic, rice cooked in tomato sauce, the sweetness of the bell pepper itself. She had written the recipe in her notebook, memorizing every measurement and technique. When she returned to Germany, when she worked in hospitals, trying to rebuild a shattered medical system, she would remember these peppers and what they taught her about abundance and generosity. Lieutenant Morrison stood to address the assembled women. Her German had improved considerably over the months, and her words came with genuine emotion. "Ladies, when you arrived here, we did not know what to expect. You were our enemies, and we were yours, but you have shown us something important about the possibility of transformation and redemption." Private Weber stood next, speaking in the German that had helped bridge the gap between two cultures. "You came here as prisoners. You leave as something different. Not quite friends perhaps, but no longer enemies. You carry with you knowledge of American abundance, but more importantly, you carry the understanding that former enemies can learn from each other." The meal continued with conversations in mixed English and German. American soldiers sat with German prisoners, sharing memories of the past months, exchanging addresses and promises to write. Several of the women had decided to request extended stays, hoping to find sponsorship that would allow them to remain in America. Others were determined to return to Germany, to carry the lessons they had learned back to a country that desperately needed new ideas and new hope. June 3, 1970. 25 years after the war's end, a reunion took place in a restaurant in Munich that specialized in international cuisine. Greta Hoffmann-Schmidt, now 50 years old and a professor of English at the University of Hamburg, had organized the gathering. Of the 63 women who had been held at Camp Lone Star, 41 were still alive, and 27 had made the journey to Munich for this anniversary reunion. Anna Kirschner-Weber sat at the head of the long table, her married name reflecting her eventual union with Private Klaus Weber, who had returned to Germany as part of the occupation forces and found her working at a Hamburg hospital in 1947. The restaurant's menu that evening featured a special dish prepared at Greta's request, stuffed bell peppers made according to Sergeant Martinez's original recipe. As the plates were served, the women fell silent, transported back to that Texas mess hall where they had first encountered impossible abundance. Ellis Muller-Braun, who had become a leader in German-American friendship societies and an advocate for European reconstruction, raised her glass. To the meal that taught us abundance was real, to the Americans who showed us that enemies could become teachers, and to the understanding that food is never just food. It is culture, it is values, it is the physical manifestation of how a society views human dignity. The women's children and grandchildren sat among them, Germans and Americans, some who had married across former enemy lines, others who had simply grown up in a world where German-American friendship was normal rather than miraculous. They listened as their mothers and grandmothers told stories of wartime captivity that sounded nothing like what they expected. Stories not of cruelty and deprivation, but of kindness and transformation. Greta stood to speak, her English now flawless after decades of teaching. We came to America as believers in propaganda that told us our enemies were cruel and weak. We discovered that they were neither. They were strong enough to show mercy and secure enough in their abundance to share it even with those who had fought against them. She held up a forkful of stuffed bell pepper. This simple dish changed everything for us, not because it was exotic or complicated, but because it was ordinary. Ordinary American food that revealed the extraordinary truth that our society had been built on lies, while America had been built on principles that actually worked. Anna added her own reflection. We learned that the strongest nations are not those that hoard resources and glorify sacrifice, but those that create abundance and share it widely. Germany's reconstruction succeeded not because we returned to what we were, but because we learned from what we had seen. In American captivity, the evening continued with laughter and tears, memories shared and lessons remembered. The stuffed bell peppers were consumed slowly, each bite carrying the weight of history and transformation. These women had been prisoners of war who discovered that their captivity offered more freedom than their service to their own country had provided. They had learned that redemption was possible, that enemies could become friends, and that sometimes the most profound lessons came wrapped in the simplest packages. A meal, after all, is never just a meal.